And after rook to e1, here comes the positional sacrifice that has been waiting this entire game, the move rook to e6. Hello everyone, today we are going to look at Samuel Reshevsky against Tigran Petrosian of 1953. This game was in many ways one of the first and finest examples of a purely positional sacrifice, because most common when you sacrifice material, you're doing it to get some deadly attack. You sacrifice a couple of pawns, or maybe an exchange, or even in some cases as much as a queen, and by doing so you get some very nice tactical combinations. But it's also very possible to sacrifice material only from a positional standpoint, and this game really highlights that idea. So let's go ahead and take a look at it. Petrosian had the black pieces here, and we see a very common opening from black, trying to gain a lot of space in the center with these moves d5 and c5, an exchange on c3, a trade in the center, and already here, I guess if we flip the board, there's already somewhat of a question of how are you going to develop this bishop, because along this diagonal, it's a little blocked in, and so you have a couple of strategies. a4 is one very common idea in these sorts of positions where you put your bishop on a3 and you have some nice targets along this diagonal. Also possible was taking once here and pushing c4 and really carving out this nice diagonal for this bishop that you can place on b2 now. Reshevsky played a bit of a strange move. He played the immediate bishop to b2, and this really invokes the move c4, and his idea, I think, was he really wanted black to play a very committal move, because now the queen side is more locked down. a4 is still possible, so the bishop could still reroute to c1 or to a3. And also now white might look to attack more on the king side now that the queen side is again locked down a bit more. So that was kind of white's idea here. And black continued with a very natural move, bishop g4. Now here already there's obviously this pin, and a lot of people would play this move to immobilize the knight and also somewhat the queen, because if the queen moves away, you quickly snap the knight. But actually after the move queen e1, Petrosian didn't take the knight, because most people would stop their calculation here and say, hey, you know, I've wrecked white's pawn structure, this seems really good. But this is also a very double-edged position, because white has a lot of good ideas to attack here. For example, f4, f3, queen to f2, at some point e4 can come. You can prepare that with like rook to e1 and bishop to c1. The king can also go to h1 and the rook can come to g1. And the point is, with these series of moves, white's going to get a lot of momentum and a lot of play on the king side. And so it's definitely also a double-edged sword here, where you have to be careful of some of the attacking possibilities that white might employ, which is why instead of taking, knight to e4 was played. Now here, knight to d2, really stopping black from ever having the ability to take the knight. We see a trade of the knights, and now the bishop for black reroutes over to g6, trying to trade this bishop here, which is, you know, it's not doing too much for the bishop that for white is the most powerful piece right now, especially when comparing the bishops, right? The bishop on b2, it's not so into the game yet, but the bishop on c2 is right now indeed aimed at black's king. So trading here the bishops makes a lot of sense, which is why also white does not decide to trade and instead plays the move e4. So queen to d7, we see the rook centralize, and now rook to e8 from black, also centralizing their rook and adding some pressure in the center, and queen to f4 here. Now, the idea of queen to f4, at least one of the ideas, is to get out of this pin, because this knight here is not a great piece, but if white let the pin stay, then the knight can maybe reroute to d3. So, for instance, a4, trying to make the bishop more useful, would allow something like knight to e5 using the pin, and after bishop to a3, the knight comes to d3, and let's say takes, queen here, the rook can come to c8, the bishop is strong. This isn't so pleasant for white. So to avoid all of this nonsense that could happen, simply queen to f4 was played here, getting rid of the pin. And from here, the move b5 was played, stopping a4, or at least trying to make a4 harder to get away with, and also maybe in the future the pawn can push further, and at some point black might want to make some moves here on the king side or on the queen side with the pawns and maybe get some pass pawns. So bishop now to d1, rerouting the bishop. Of course, the bishop here for the time being was being contested with this bishop, and so rerouting it, for example, to g4 makes total sense for Reshevsky. And now rook to e7, stacking rooks, or looking to stack rooks, but in this case the bishop forces the queen to come to e8, and this rook also can come, of course, to d8, for example. And now after e5, we see the move a5, simply again grabbing space and at some point looking maybe to push b4. And after rook to e3, we have the move rook to d8, and after rook to e1, here comes the positional sacrifice that has been waiting this entire game, the move rook to e6. And I think first it's important to understand why this move even is good. If we compare, and I think a good idea here would be to compare the before and after position of this move rook to e6. So before the move rook to e6, really white has all of the ideas here. For example, h4, h5 is one possible idea of getting some play on the king side. Of course, more importantly is these center pawns with d5 and especially e6 coming, and these pawns, it doesn't matter how many pieces black has here, these pawns can definitely start running down the board. And aside from that, also black, notice, has this very awkward piece here where it's going to take a lot of moves and it's going to be quite awkward to get this knight really anywhere useful. And so for that reason, rook to e6 was played. And if we compare this to what happened after the exchange is accepted, well now, first of all, h4, h5 is not as powerful. The king can be protected on the 7th rank by the queen or the rook. Also, the bishop has an extra square, so there's no fear of the bishop being trapped or anything like that. And of course, h5 is much more protected. Also, and more importantly, the center pawns are now stopped, right? e5 cannot come to e6, and the move d5 is much harder to get away with. And so, for the time being, white's extra center control is really limited, whereas black's extra queenside control and queenside pawns can start to run down the board. And then, again, looking at this knight, it no longer has to take a very awkward and long path. It can now very quickly come to this d5 central square where it's going to do a lot. And then a final point, I guess I should add, the bishop here is now uncontested. Before, there was this other light square bishop, but now that that has been traded off, this bishop is basically, for the rest of the game, going to dominate over the light squares. And, the bishop can come to d3 or e4 at some point, and really any endgame that is reached from this position, all of the light squares, black is going to have a slight edge over them because, of course, white does not have a light square bishop. And so for that reason, this exchange sacrifice is just a beautiful idea here for Petrosian. Now, rook to e6, the rook was actually not accepted here, and instead a4 was played. And I guess the idea was to try to improve this bishop here and realize that this rook is not really ever going to go back, so you always have the ability to take later on. But after knight to e7, white did finally take, because white realized that, like, if they don't take, the knight's going to come here anyways, and if they don't get at least some material advantage, then positionally they're going to be losing anyways. And so bishop takes, pawn takes, and now the same thing that I mentioned before applies. The extra pawns here are running down, the extra pawns here are not. The bishop is very powerful, the knight can come in, and white really has no clear attacking ideas. And so queen to f1 was played, now knight to d5, the rook moves, and now bishop to d3. And here, white gave back the exchange sacrifice, basically saying, like, yeah, your exchange sacrifice is very powerful, I don't want to deal with that, I'm going to give back the material, and by doing so, get a very drawish position. Because otherwise, if they move queen to f2, for example, black's totally dominating. something like b4 will follow. These pawns are going to be basically unstoppable, especially considering the fact that, a lot of these key squares here are non-accessible for white because of this very powerful bishop here. The knight also playing a role. So something like takes. Sure, white has an a-pawn that maybe you can play rook to a8 to stop, but ultimately these black pawns here are simply going to run down the board, and it's very clear what's about to happen. And so a very beautiful game. I guess from here, after the bishop was taken, more moves were played, but ultimately it's a drawn position. Materially and positionally, both players have a passed pawn, and nothing special is really going on. It's just a draw. But a very beautiful positional sacrifice, if we go back here, just changing the momentum and the nature of the position. Because here, white is the only one who has good attacking chances. But after this exchange sacrifice, suddenly black has a lot of ways to make a lot of progress here, and white seems very, very stuck. And so, again, really nice idea, really nice game. Hopefully this is maybe a little inspiring for your own games to look for these positional sacrificing gems. Thank you guys so much for watching the video. Subscribe if you're new around here, and I'll see you next time. Peace out.